and it's going to have a magnet clip in at the top, so you can't get in it unless you really try. So yeah, I think we'll definitely get a spotlight there, because that's going to be really so dark. I didn't realise how dark it was. Okay, should we come out of here, and then if anyone's got any more questions, we can talk about that outside.
You need like back hearing to just...
Can we get the sound on?
Yeah.
So that's just to navigate around.
So does anyone have any questions before we hand over to... No questions? Anybody else? No? Okay, I think maybe we'll hand over for Elizabeth Price.
Okay, great. Thanks, Abby. Thank you, Abby. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be introducing Elizabeth Price's exhibition, which is called Felt Tip. I don't want to try to draw out too much the connections between the exhibitions, because, I mean, in part we invited both of the artists to do shows at this time just because we were particularly excited about their work, but a few slightly surprising or serendipitous connections between the two have emerged, actually. Abby's been talking about sci-fi. The title of Danielle's exhibition comes from this novella by Ursula Le Guin. And in the two videos that Elizabeth has made for this exhibition, she's been thinking a lot about sci-fi as a form as well, and I'll talk a bit more about that. I suppose something else that I'd mention to you at this point is just in the way that this exhibition of Danielle's, that across just 4 pieces, ranges from glass blowing to 16mm filmmaking to architectural intervention to VR. You know, a range of technologies from the very, very recent to the very, very ancient. Elizabeth's exhibition also has a whole range of different approaches to making images. So there is a CGI video in the show, but there are also pinhole photos, so some of the kind of earliest ways of making images. There's newsprint, there are, again, architectural interventions. So I think both of them have come at these spaces in very, very different ways and are using a very wide array of different materials, different strategies, to think about how they might be able to tweak the perceptions of the space. As Abby kind of mentioned, talking about this lowered ceiling, to do these kinds of quite subtle interventions takes a huge amount of work. There's a lot lying behind it. Danielle talks a lot about being very influenced by some of the Brazilian artists of the 60s, but I think he was also very interested in what some of the Californian artists of that generation were doing too. So people like James Turrell, I'm sure you'll know, or Robert Irwin, artists who were trying to use light as one of their means. And I think with this quite radical seeming gesture of almost clearing out the spaces of objects and filling it with very little in terms of material things, but really quite a lot in terms of projected images, in terms of glass. It's something that I think for me is quite exciting about Danielle's show. I'll talk just a little bit about Elizabeth's before we go into Gallery 3, because people are still working there. But I'm guessing probably most people are familiar in one way or another with Elizabeth Price's work. I'll give you a kind of a whistle-stop tour. So she's probably best known for having won the Turner Prize. That was back in 2012. She's best known for making video installations. So a friend of mine who hates video art says she's the only video artist whose work he actually likes. She makes very, very short, very snappy, very dense videos. They're usually between about 4 minutes and 7 minutes long. They're pretty short, like music videos. And that's not a coincidence. She has a background in music. When she was a student at the Ruskin in Oxford in the late 80s, she was in a band called Tallulah Gosh. Look them up, they're pretty good. They were around for about a year or something like that. She ended up quitting the band, I think, because she hated performing. But then they got a call about 6 years later. It turned out they were quite big in Japan, having done kind of one album. So So she was telling Abby and I the other night that they did this kind of week-long tour of Japan in the mid-90s, and then she's never performed again since. But she became an artist. She was working with sculpture for about 15 years, so from the early 90s to the mid-2000s. And then she kind of described herself as hitting a bit of a wall in the mid-2000s, just thinking, why am I making more things, these kind of quite boring, she felt, objects at the time. She was working as a librarian at the time, and she was becoming increasingly interested in different forms of archiving, different kinds of ways of categorizing different information and different collections in particular. But she was also very interested in the kind of roles that administrators have in these kinds of organizations, the ways that they might be able to narrate these kinds of forms of knowledge or hidden knowledge or possibly forgotten knowledge. So she made in 2005 what was her first video. It was very, very basic. She just made it on her laptop then, and it took the form of a slideshow with a narrator. The narrator speaks to the viewer through a kind of a voice that just comes up on screen as a series of text. And that kind of narrative voice has been key to all of the videos she's made since. It's often a very unreliable narrator. When you start to watch her videos, you start to realize that this narrator is not to be trusted in one way or another, or that the voice fractures, or that the narrator might not be one person at all, but many. She comes back to this idea of a kind of a chorus of narrators over and over again. So that's something about her work. As she's kind of gone along over the last 10 or 15 years, they've become rather more dramatic in scale, and even with this exhibition, I would say immersive. Probably important to mention that we collaborated with a couple of different organizations on producing these new works of Elizabeth's. The Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, one of the biggest modern art museums in the US. Film and Video Umbrella, who are based in London and really support artists to make new films. And then the exhibition will be touring to the Whitworth in Manchester towards the end of the year, where Elizabeth will be having her first retrospective. But yeah, she's known primarily for video, but as we'll see moving into the space, this is an exhibition that's full of all kinds of other things. Newsprint, architectural interventions, even sandbags for seating. So let's move into Gallery 3. You'll see that it's very much a work in progress. I'm sorry to say we're not going to be able to show you the galleries, the videos in Gallery 4 this evening, but what we'll do is to circulate a link so you can see both videos ahead of the opening. So I started out by saying that Elizabeth is very interested in the archive, and I think perhaps sometimes we have these associations of when artists start to work with archives, the work might feel a little dry, a little academic, a little worthy. I think Elizabeth has a very different relationship to the archive. In fact, the way that she talks about her relationship with archival materials is to try to make them to tell stories other than their own, to try to take them into a whole other realms that they didn't themselves occupy. So what we're surrounded by are a series of images that started out life as about this size. They're actually images from fashion magazines from the 70s and 80s, from couture adverts that she has then sliced off, in most cases, their arms and the heads, and then made pinhole photos of these images. So she's pricked a series of holes through the images themselves and then exposed them through a pinhole for a period of up to about an hour. So what you're getting is what almost feels like a scan of these magazine advertising images. What she's really interested in this process is the way that she takes these kinds of things away from these kind of slightly, pricey, flouncy kind of gowns and robes and so on, to something that feels much more kind of religious, as a number of people have pointed out. She talks about them taking on the guise of almost ecclesiastical robes, but to produce this kind of space that has, and I should say the lights will be relatively low in here. There'll be a kind of feeling of gloom within this space, to kind of take them to a whole other realm. The title of this whole series of images is The Governing Body. So again, she's kind of coming back to this idea of a group of people, a chorus, a constituency, she would say. But she's very interested in how do you make archives images speak from beyond the grave, she would say. She was talking about these images in terms of possession. They're not only in her possession, but they might seem to be somehow possessed just by this form of reanimation, of giving them a new life through a pinhole camera. The other element that you won't have failed to miss is this architectural intervention. What are we calling it, Cedric? We call it a concertina wall, or yeah. There's no kind of, it's not a work unto itself, it's just an intervention that Elizabeth has made in the space. There'll be a video playing in the foyer, which will be a short interview with Elizabeth, about 10 or 15 minutes long. When we were doing that interview earlier in the week, and I was asking her about this, she just said that she's really fascinated by these partial spaces, these kinds of spaces like pavilions or tents, both of which she's made works about in the past, or even like church architecture, where you're neither inside or outside, you're kind of looking through a grille or through a kind of gauze. You feel both, you feel only partly enclosed. So there's kind of an idea that she's trying to play with here, but of course when you first come into the gallery, your view of the whole space will be a little obscured. The angles of these walls will be kind of breaking up the images. To me, when she first kind of sketched out this idea for this wall, it reminded me a little bit of those, I don't actually know the title and the name of them, but a kind of Victorian image-making device, a kind of a circle where you spin... Zoetrope, yeah, absolutely. So a kind of early form of like moving image making, where you kind of move around and images seem to come to life somehow. And I think she certainly is interested in some of these like longer histories of making images move or making them animated in different kinds of ways. The other element that will be in this space is a scattering of these newsprint, kind of not quite posters, I suppose, and it says, you can just about read, "Give prisoners the vote." They'll be scattered over the floor. The description she said to me was like autumn leaves. People will be free to walk over them, pick them up, take them, put them down, as they will. We have 5,000 here printed, so we'll do a kind of initial spread and see if we need to print more. It's a text that she's used before in a work. She wanted to use it again, and the reason that she gave for wanting to use this text was a kind of way of seeming to give this chorus of headless figures a voice of some kind. She has no problem if the text is read as a purely straightforwardly political comment. She's fine with that. She's also fine with the kind of way in which its repetition might suggest many different voices speaking or chanting or so on. So the typeface, which she worked on with a graphic designer on, you will see repeated in one of the videos as well. Are there any questions yet? Yeah.
With this thing,
Yeah.
can people like touch it and like walk underneath it?
They can certainly walk underneath it, I think. Probably best not for them to touch it, but I don't think it's really an issue. I don't know in terms of Cedric, in terms of like weight bearing, if people are leaning on it, how fixed it is. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah. So I mean, it's stable. It's yeah. So I wouldn't be too concerned if you're finding that people are touching it. Yeah. So yeah, there are two videos in the exhibition, which we fortunately won't be able to see in situ this evening. We're very much hoping they will be ready for tomorrow night, but it's been a very, very complex installation. I'll do my best to talk you through what the two videos are. I'll probably just preface it by saying they're much more exciting to watch than they are to have explained to you. So just in terms of technical details, there are two of them. They constitute the first two parts of a trilogy. The whole of that trilogy will be presented at the Whitworth in Manchester in October. I mentioned sci-fi at the beginning, and I'll come back to that now. There are two videos. The first is called Coal. It's a 4-screen projection. Maybe once I finish giving the introduction, we can take a peek into the space and you'll see how it's configured. Coal is back projected on 4 free-hanging screens, which are hung all the way from the top of that double-height ceiling. It's Coal spelled K-O-H-L, and it tells a kind of ghost story. Elizabeth was saying in advance of the show that she's become really interested in both ghost stories and sci-fi because they're kinds of genres that we're very happy with, but there aren't any given rules in them. Unexpected things happen, people can travel in time, people can come back from the dead. She talks about them as very flexible containers for different kinds of stories, or she talks about them as well as promiscuous kinds of stories. You can put all kinds of weird and unexpected things into them, and somehow a narrative might evolve. So Coal itself takes the form of a ghost story. It takes the form of a ghost story where certain kinds of spirits start to emerge from the former, I suppose they're the ghosts of industry. They start to become present in what were once mine shafts, but have now become underground gyms, data centres, wine bars. She calls them the visitants, and it slowly starts to tell a story of these visitants that people start to cite in these different spaces. It's combined with archival images from a museum of mining that's in Wakefield, a series of photos of minehead architecture that she's flipped. And it's kind of, like a lot of her films, it's based on an element of truth. There's a story that the flooded mine shafts, I think particularly in this area of Yorkshire, are very, very effective acoustic devices. And so the story goes, if you kind of shout into one of these flooded mine shafts, you can hear that voice the next village across. And she became really fascinated with the ways in which mining as an industry, so many of its traces above land kind of wiped out or somehow forgotten about in media narratives. But there's this whole subterranean architecture, subterranean traces. So she starts to think about this as an acoustic instrument, a space for songs and jokes and different kinds of voices. And so the 4 narrators that form the chorus of this piece, Coal, each of which get their own screen, start to tell jokes. They tell jokes that kind of echo around underneath these Yorkshire towns and villages. As with a lot of Elizabeth's works, it kind of finishes with a song. All of these different images and objects become increasingly animated or exercised in one way or another. So that's the first piece, and it's really focusing on the changing shape of industry in this country. The second takes the form of a 2-screen projection, 2 vertical screens, about 7 metres in total. That piece is called Felt Tip, and that takes the form of a kind of sci-fi journey. Elizabeth, for many years, she doesn't know why, has been collecting men's neckties from the 1980s. She's really in a fetish of sorts. The reason that she describes as why she kind of kept coming back to these neckties is because they have some of the strangest patterns on them. And this is a kind of moment, I guess, before you start to get very cheaply printed neckties with, I guess, cartoons or novelty, whatever, on them. But you actually get these kind of very intricately woven patterns, motifs, and so on. She started to get really into the ways in which some of this from this particular moment actually started to look quite like computer chips, circuit boards, and so on. So it's a moment where, in the West, the kind of workplace is shifting from industrial to post-industrial, when the office workspace is getting transformed by the use of computers and desktop publishing and so on. And so she started to kind of read this collection of neckties. I think she has about 80 now, as somehow like this, I don't know, repressed anxiety or trauma about people getting replaced in offices by computers, and how it kind of plays out in this like slightly archaic kind of thing of the time. So she'd been collecting these things for years. She didn't know what she'd do with them. And then a couple of years ago, she got them professionally photographed, kind of very straightforward, I mean, almost like anthropologically, black and white, very high quality. And I told you it would sound boring if I talked about this. And it's this material that takes is the initiating material for the film itself. And then I won't go too far into the video, but in a very short amount of time, you realize that you're in a kind of future environment. It's being narrated to you by administrators in some kind of shadowy organization who don't learn what it might be. And they're people who are working for an employer who's asked them to use their DNA as a kind of storage. That they actually become the physical repositories for the information of this kind of shadowy organization. Which is something that Elizabeth told me is technically possible now. But she wanted to kind of think about what does it mean to become institutionalized? What does it mean to carry the kind of burden of a workplace within oneself? It's all much funnier and weirder than this description is allowing for. And again, music plays a kind of a very, very particular role in the piece as these neckties start to become animated. And if you imagine a kind of Tron type kind of dream sequence, the camera zooms into the ties themselves, into the warp and weft of the fabric. I'm sure there's huge amounts about these two videos that I'm missing out, but suffice it to say they go faster than my description of them did. Elizabeth jokes in an interview we did for the exhibition that her videos are actually all twice as long as the advertised length because you need to watch them twice. And it's kind of true. It's true because there's so much happening, you want to watch them again. It's true because they're so concise. Watching them twice doesn't take too much of your time. But they're really quite extraordinary. I mean, yeah, I'll go back to my earlier point. There are so many people I know who feel that they're allergic to artist moving image or artist video, are really obsessed with Elizabeth's works. I think for me these are the most ambitious pieces she's made. They're really incredible. They're incredible even just watching on a laptop. So seeing them projected at 7 meters, as I'm hoping we're going to be able to do tomorrow evening, it's going to be something quite special. Are there any questions? Sam?
That's a boring one, sorry.
Please.
What's Elizabeth's view on filming and photography?
Totally fine.
It's absolutely fine.
Yeah, absolutely fine. Yeah. I would say a quick word about the seating in Gallery 4, which is being finished off. Elizabeth's really interested in how making video can go beyond just the digital file itself, but can encompass the whole of the space. So just as in, I suppose, what we're standing in now, she might think of as a kind of expanded video. In that space too, she's thought very, very carefully about the configuration of the whole space, even down to what you're sitting on. So there won't be seats. There'll be a pile of sandbags that she's designed herself, a stack of grey sandbags. I guess this is kind of going back to her beginnings in sculpture, but she wanted, within all of these quite fantastical, swerving, digressive stories, she wanted just the kind of literal materials. And, you know, these kind of geological ghosts that happen in there are kind of one part of that, but she wanted just this kind of dead weight of sandbags. So they'll be piled in a small mound. One video is projected at that angle, another at right angles. She's very interested in how people can kind of constitute a group, an audience there, and can be turning from one video to the next. So there'll be this kind of small mound for people to sit on in the middle. Yeah?
There will be a countdown screen on that wall over there, which says which video is playing when people are starting to come in, and when it starts again, and where the relationship with the other video. So there is a cycle because the two videos are playing one after the other, but there is no order. I mean, even 9 days, but it doesn't matter if the people start to see.
And the two videos are short. One's 5 minutes, one's 9 minutes. Cedric says they alternate. When one is not playing, there's a weird kind of screensaver type thing plays in its place. So it feels like there's something going on still. So she did talk a little about this gallery as a kind of antechamber or a waiting room or a reading room for people to come in to acquaint themselves. They might see it's not starting for 3 minutes, but they spend time reading. She's very happy with that, and I think the amount of text in her work and paper in her work really speaks to this kind of, she sometimes talks about her work as primarily about publishing in some form. or another. It might take the form of video or sculpture or whatever, but she does think about it as publishing somehow. So yeah, I'm sorry that we can't watch the videos now, but we can share the videos via Vimeo, I think, with you, either this evening or tomorrow morning.
Can we see the real space?
Absolutely, yeah.
Think louder. Do you want to hit that note?
So those backbones are they're gonna continue up until here. So people are invited to like go through that kind of corridor first.
Yeah. So if you follow me into this space. So I think you'll maybe start to see why it's been a challenging one. These screens which are hanging from the ceiling have to be like 14 mil apart. Everything's got to be precise for it to work. They're then back projected on. So this one is cold. And yeah, as I said, each of the screens is its own narrator. I think 3 are women and 1 is a man. Occasionally they all speak as one, and they only speak in 4-letter words. So they often kind of mangle the words that they're speaking. They might be words with more or less than 4 letters, but they kind of cram them down into 4. And then this is felt tip. So roughly the same screen size as these, but 2 placed top to bottom. And the neckties that I talked about occasionally will kind of come back and will be hanging the full length of that piece. And yeah, the sandbags, I guess, will be somewhere in the middle there. That space at the front will be closed off. There'll be an emergency exit door there, but that'll be out of action, that front space.
You're wondering how
What's the question?
Yeah,
green
we
room?
have to get through there to get to...
There's a door.
Yeah, there's a door. Yeah.
You forget that things are out.
And so yeah, again, this kind of the architectural intervention gets repeated through here. They start out on the left, quite wide apart, and get closer and closer together on the right.
Is this carpet going to be here?
Yep. Yeah, everything will be carpeted. The sandbags are in the same grey.
So all of that was flooring as well.
Yeah. Everything is carpeted. Yeah. Did I miss something?
I said it was part of a trilogy.
Yes, part of the trilogy. 3rd part will be at the Whitworth. The overarching title for the trilogy is The Teachers, I think. Slow Dance. The 3rd part will be called The Teachers. And so there's a kind of logic with these that this is part 1, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is part 2, 1, 2, and then the 3rd part will be another 4 screens at that double height. And she associates that, I mean, it's somewhat kind of subtle in the videos themselves, but she associates them with different kinds of labor. So this is industry, kind of subterranean part. This is the kind of managerial level that links, I suppose, the factory floor or the mine with the executive level. And then the 3rd part that she'll be making for Manchester will be the executive level. At the Whitworth. Yeah. So it opens there in October. Yeah. So?
I had a question
Yeah.
about Gallery 2, if you
Yeah.
can answer it. The sort of geometrical
Sure.
light shaft shapes
Yes.
in the ceiling.
Sure, yeah. I think Abby touched on this quickly, but one of Danielle's very early passions was post-war Brazilian art, so sometimes called neo-concrete art, thinking of people like Elio Oiticica or Ligia Clark, Ligia Pape, people who were making different forms of abstraction, who were using hard-edged abstractions, bright colours, a lot of those things that are familiar from Western traditions. The difference there was that often people were able to manipulate or participate with these sculptures. Like with Ligier Clark's Bichos sculptures, means like little creatures, you could actually kind of move them by hand. And they often take the form of these kinds of triangular or kind of tessellated forms. So I think it's a kind of basic form that he's returned to in different kinds of ways. And as Abby was saying, this kind of, he's not particularly interested in a kind of culture is over here, nature is over here thing. He's interested in the two kind of coming together, becoming confused in different kinds of ways. I mean, I suppose the way that I read Daniel's show now, having kind of seen it up for a few days, is the four works are in different ways, different forms of abstracted nature. They're kind of different forms of like renderings, I suppose, of nature. In glass, as VR, but as you said, a kind of a drawing of nature, a film of nature, and then this kind of architecture as nature. So I think they do a couple of things, but one is a nod to different histories of abstraction in Latin America. And another is this kind of like, thinking about artists, James Turrell and others who like to kind of cut into architecture to bring light through. Yeah. Any final questions, practical or otherwise?
Will the movie be shown on the other side of the screen as well?
So it's back. It's just back projected. So it's just sitting here. So
Mills.
Oh, I see. So no, the viewing area is here. I mean, people will be able to get around the back, but I mean, I'd hope they just stay in this. So, the text would be reversed. Yeah. Yeah. This is very consciously kind of put together as the viewing area. And then these wooden slats, these baffles, will be much tighter. You can see at the top how close together they'll be at that point. So people will be able to walk between that back area, but that's really backstage. Okay, let's leave it there. Thank you.